Okay, we'll kick things off now and get started. First of all, welcome. Appreciate everybody who has signed up and has joined the meeting tonight. This is the first meeting for the new M chapter of the BMW CCA, so we're very pleased to have this opportunity to present this. This is our inaugural meeting. Thanks for your support. Appreciate that very much. For those of you who are chapter members, very much appreciated. For those of you who are not chapter members yet, we hope that you'll enjoy this experience and take the opportunity to join the chapter and to enjoy the benefits of M chapter membership. First of all, to introduce myself, and then we'll go around the horn here and complete the introductions. But I am Martin Bullen. I'm the president of the M chapter. I have been a BMW CCA member since 1993, I think it is. I've been involved, been active in the club for most of that time period. I've been a long-time instructor with the club, club racer, a member of the board of the Delaware Valley chapter of the club, past president of the Delaware Valley chapter, and now president of the M chapter. I'm honored to have this opportunity to support the BMW CCA further, to further grow the club and to offer a new dimension to the membership experience for all of the members out there. What I'd like to do next is to quickly go around the horn to two of my colleagues who are here. I have Esteban Valentin, who is the vice president of the chapter, and Yves Delensky, who is the treasurer of the chapter. And I'd like to give them the opportunity just to introduce themselves, and then after that we'll move on to Larry's presentation. Esteban.
I hope everyone's having a great evening. Like Martin said, thanks for joining us. We appreciate you being part of this today. My name is Esteban. I'm out of Florida. Local chapter is Sunshine Beamers. I am happy to be the vice president of the M chapter. I've been with the club for 4 years. I probably haven't been long on the CCA, but I've been trying to get more and more involved with everything that's local and you know, the whole United States wide, because I just want to make sure that we have, like people say, that some of that younger blood. I'm not very young, but I'm not older either. So I'm trying to see if I can bring some of that younger energy and make sure that I can help the club grow. So really happy to be part of the chapter. Really happy for the opportunity, and I'm hoping that I can meet a lot of you going forward in some of the meetings that we're going to have in the future, and some of the ones that we're going to do face to face. Hopefully, after we get past the pandemic and we can start doing a lot of the face to face meetings.
Great, thanks, Esteban. Yves.
Good evening. I'm Yves Delensky. I've been with the club for, I don't know, 15 years. I've got an E36 M3 that I take to the track, and an X1 daily driver. I'm really excited about what we can do with this chapter and the events we're going to have similar to this one. So just working out some technical things in the background.
Thanks. Just a quick note on this evening's presentation. So the format is a question answer. Larry is going to present. You'll notice that Ring works a lot like Zoom, if you're familiar with that, and of course a lot of us are, thanks to current events. But down at the bottom, if you're on a computer, I'm not sure if it's going to work on any iDevice or anything like that, but there's a Q&A button. So you can feel free, please, during the course of the presentation, to click on the Q&A button, ask any questions that pop into mind as Larry's presenting, and we'll do our best to bring those to Larry after he's finished, and hopefully we can get additional dimensions to the M experience. So with all of that said, I'd like to introduce Larry Koch. He's the past M brand manager for BMW North America. He worked at BMW for 27 years, I think, Larry.
Yep.
And retired 8 years ago, but he's a longtime supporter and member of the club. A member of the club, I think, before even working for BMW. So he has a wealth of experience and stories that he can talk your ear off over the course of many hours when suitably incentivized. So we're just going to try to contain him to about somewhere between, well, 45 minutes, maybe an hour or so to this evening. Everybody has to get to bed and so forth. But at a certain point, for those of us on the East Coast, but I hope you'll enjoy this. Bear with me because I have to call up Larry's PowerPoint now, and that might take just a minute or two to get everything synchronized. So thanks once again for attending, and Larry, just give me a couple of minutes, and we'll get this show properly on the road.
Go for it. You can change the slide when you get that far.
Yep. Okay.
Okay, just to review some of what Martin said real quick. I did start out as a member in 1979, owning a 2002 TII, which I sold to go back to graduate school. I was working for Ford in the early 80s and thought it'd be kind of neat to apply to BMW because I liked their cars better. And lo and behold, they gave me a job in 1985, and I retired at the end of 2012. A couple of noteworthy things while I was there, besides working in sales and marketing, was back in the mid-90s when Mobile Tradition, now called Classic, was started up in Germany. We started up the same thing, and I worked with somebody I'm sure many of you have heard of, and that's Eric Wensberg, in putting together the 1996 celebration of BMW at the Monterey Historic Races. That was a very big club event. We were over 12 to 1,400 club members there. After he left the company, I became the club liaison and did that from 98 to 12 and was M-brand manager for 2 different stints, along with motorsport manager until I retired. And currently, my car fix is basically focused on the Hilton Head Concord Motoring Festival, and actually I manage the Savannah Speed Classic, which is a vintage race in downtown Savannah, Georgia, which is where I live. Slide. Okay, so I had a good question from several that Martin had sent me, and the first one actually fit right into something that I really wanted to do, and that is give you guys an understanding of where the thinking goes in running a car manufacturer, and we'll tie this to M, but the reality of it is it's pretty straightforward. But in the beginning, before M, BMW was racing in the 30s, and they're using their engineering department to get stuff done. And then success came again after the 30s and after the war and after the 50s, and they got some money and they played around with it in the 60s, and they were using 4-cylinder engines in some cars for racing, and they were becoming successful enough that they decided that since they wanted to promote a sports image, that motorsport should be part of it. And of course, then, as many people know, Bob Lutz, who was the vice president of sales and marketing of the company, started motorsport in 1972. Slide. They basically started out building race cars. As we know, the CSL and the Formula 2 cars were their primary focus in the beginning. But one of the things they were also doing is screwing around with taking, and this is typical of anybody who's working in a race shop, is taking production cars and kind of making hot rods out of them. And they were doing it for the race car drivers, and they were also doing it for some BMW management afterwards. Principally, it started out with the race car drivers in their own, and then after a while, management was like, I'd like to have one of those too. And as it turned out during that time period, the typical thing to do was to take the 7 Series motor, which was I believe, a 3 or a 3.3 liter engine, and putting it in a 5 Series car where the biggest engine could have been a 2.8 liter engine. Then they decided to seriously get into racing, and they started building the M1. They really only built it as a production car because they wanted to go racing, and they had to build 400 of them, which they eventually did. But by the time they got finished with all that, all the rules and everything had changed, and it really wasn't as successful as they wanted it to be. At a later time, through the 80s, motorsport was building cars using the M1 engine, subsequently known as the M88 engine, which was developed from the M49 engine that was in the CSL. And they built the first batch of what we know of as M cars. The E30 M3 was nothing more than a 4-cylinder version of the 6-cylinder in the M5 and the When they got into the early 90s, they realized that this could be a real viable business. So M and motorsport kind of separated out. Technically, if you look at it corporate-wise, motorsport became M, and then there was a motorsport that was started up. But in essence, motorsport kept going and making race cars, and M was building road cars. Slide. And it says that. The big issue here is the economics. And follow me for a minute. This is a little bit dry, but once you understand it, a lot of questions you guys are going to have, you're going to be able to answer yourself. So when race cars are built, they're usually built in really small numbers at great cost. And the cost is diverted off to the concept of improving engineering of road cars and marketing goals. And the development of race cars is very high, and the speed development is very quick. And the cars are basically considered obsolete in 3 years. It's only been in the last 25, 30 years that people collected old race cars. Before that, you used it for 3 years and you threw it away. Sales of race cars rarely covered any kind of development costs, although the current customer race car program is changing that dynamic. Slide. So the M cars starting in the late 80s, but really into the 90s, were developed from standard AG cars, as we know. And development costs of new engines, parts, and the government homologation are high. So in order to recoup that cost, you've got to figure out how many cars you want to sell, and then divide that development cost by the number of cars you're selling and add that to the actual price of the car that's going down the assembly line. And then you add your transportation and your marketing and your distribution costs, and that's how you get to a price. And then from there, you can adjust that based on what the market's doing. But if you're in a competitive market, that's pretty tight. The problem with M car sales versus AG cars is you've got fairly high development costs, but you've got a very low sales volume to spread it over. So as opposed to the AG cars, where you develop the 3 Series and there's more development involved because it's the beginning of the 3 Series in terms of development of the chassis and everything. But over the life cycle of the car, if you're going to sell 1 million of them, you can divide that development cost into 1 million vehicles, and it becomes pretty inexpensive. And that's why the cost difference becomes a big factor. Now, where the money comes in, and sometimes you've seen this, I just saw it today. You might have heard in the news that Ford announced they made $2.5 billion in the third quarter. And it's like, wow, they were losing money up until now, and now they're making it like crazy. Well, the way that works is you do your development cost per car based on the number of cars you think you're going to sell in the life cycle of a car. But if the car turns out to be more successful, then you end up covering your development cost faster. And all of a sudden, the profitability of toward the end of the life cycle becomes greater. So change to the next slide. If you look at this chart, the blue boxes represent year 1 through 6 of a typical M car life cycle. And as a matter of fact, the numbers here aren't that much different than the E46 for the US, but not for the world. And the blue ones designate how many cars you think you're going to sell, and you divide the development cost over those cars. The brown ones actually dictate how many cars you actually sold. So each year you're selling more cars than you thought you were. And the gray one represents your actual development costs being depreciated over the life of the car. And you'll notice when you get to year 5, all of a sudden you've pretty much covered, or you've covered at least half the development cost with the volume. And you get to year 6 and you don't have any development cost anymore, and you start making real money with the car. Because I give you a hypothetical example because I don't know the real numbers, but if you have a $50,000 car, it might very well be the actual cost of running that car down an assembly line and building it could be $12,000 to $15,000. And another $15,000 of that car is development costs, and the rest of it is all the marketing and the distribution and everything else that goes into it. And I'm using that as an example. That's not an actual car. So when you get to year 6 in this case, all of a sudden your real cost may be $15,000 on that $50,000 car, but now you're making $35,000 on every car. And that's why when you see you get toward the end of a life cycle on a car and they can offer a $5,000 rebate, it's because they're already making a lot more than that on the car. So if they have to give part of it away and it keeps the volume up, they just keep making more money on each one they make. If you plan properly, you shouldn't end up with a lot of that, but it's intoxicating to make all that money that most car manufacturers will try and exceed the number. Now, of course, the reverse of that, looking at that, is if those brown columns were shorter than the blue columns, and you get to the end, you might find you never covered your development costs. And yeah, you made money on the car, but you never really made very much because you never covered your development cost. A perfect example of where development costs disappeared a long time ago, and they made a lot of money on it, was the old Crown Victoria. If you remember that, that car was around for 20 years, and I'd be willing to bet the development costs on that car were probably covered 10 years earlier. Another example in the complete opposite direction would be, say, manufacturer Ford pickups. If they can sell a lot more of them, all of a sudden they're making a ton of money, and they spread the costs over 1 million units, so it works well. Okay, go to the next slide. So, as somebody said in their question, BMW M started out as a bumpy start in the US, and they did. The cost of developing the cars for the US market was extremely high for a couple of reasons. One was that in those days, the Euro models were significantly different in terms of safety standards and pollution standards than the American models. So a lot of that had to be developed for the American market. And you look at the M5 and the M6, and they were actually at that time toward the end of their product life cycle. So you were supposed to build 500 M5s in one model year, and you ended up building a lot more than that, which was another subject. But the reality of it is you had to take all that development cost and divide it over a very small number of cars, and that made them very expensive. And they actually were relatively hard to sell. The first 500 of them went very quickly, and after that, they started struggling because the price of them was much, much higher than a typical 5 Series. The same thing happened to the M6. The M3 was a little bit different because we had a longer time to sell them, but even those cars were hard to sell in the last year and a half. And interestingly enough, many of you may not know that in the 1991 model year, the last year they were sold in the US, they weren't certified for sale in California because they didn't pass California emission standards. So the total number of cars was so low that development costs were high, which made the car prices high. And unfortunately, the E34 M5 launch into a weak economy basically exacerbated the problem that already existed. So the business case for M cars in America was pretty weak by 1992. They made a little money on it, but it wasn't very much, and it was an awful lot of work. So they had to come up with a different formula to make the thing work. So go to the next slide. And you'll find that the thing that really helped was when they came up with the concept for the American version of the E36 M3. Now, a lot of people will lament the fact that it didn't have the Euro engine in it. But if it did have the Euro engine in it, it would have sold for the same price as a 7 Series car, or about 50% more than a 328 IS at the time. And where that becomes important is that if you have a customer that walks in the door and they're looking at a 328 IS, and you walk them over and say, well, there's this M3 and it's really neat and it's got all these neat features, and you explain the whole thing to them, and it's only 15 or 18% more than the 325 IS, it's pretty easy to get a lot of people to say, wow, that's not very much. I think I can afford that. I'll do that. But if you built a car that was 50% higher, which is very much the problem we had with the first generation of the M cars, it's very difficult to convert anybody from walking into a showroom to buy a standard production car to get them into an M car. It's just too big a jump, and it doesn't work. So the cars don't sell very well. And at the end of the day, it's about selling cars, not trying to make the price high. So that's one of the reasons why the E36 M3 sold very well. In fact, the pricing was such that it actually put the Japanese competition, really, it hit them hard, and it put a lot of them pretty much out of business. At that time, the Mazda RX-7 and the 300ZX Nissan, and there was a Mitsubishi product that were all out there that sold in the low 40s, and the M3 was selling for about 37 or 38. And the Japanese cars couldn't compete on the performance, and they ended up all kind of withering in the next couple of years. The M3 just fed right into that market. So the success of that created the base for making the M cars out of the Z3, the Coupe, and the Roadster. The same formula using the same engine allowed us to have a price bump that was very reasonable, and we sold quite a few of them. And in the process of all this, to promote the motorsport image of it, we went back to racing again with the M3, and we're highly successful with it against the Porsche, which, as it turned out, was one of its primary competitors among the enthusiast groups. So in essence, M was reborn again because we changed the business model. So change the slide. So by the time we get into the 2000s, M is maturing. And one of the reasons why is the Euro model and the US federal model regulations had become almost the same. So it allowed a more economical way to bring the Euro models into the US. So you'll notice that later on in the M Roadster and the M Coupe, we were bringing in the Euro engine, which was essentially the E46 M3 engine. We did the same thing with the M5 and the M6 models during that time period. And there was a price jump to it, but because we could develop or spread the cost over a much larger number without having to have an individual US model, it made it so the pricing structure was still quite adequate and we could sell quite a few of the cars. So the spread between the top AG car and the M car was within reason for getting a lot of customers to move up. So the sales volume, along with the M image, allowed them to grow and they became very hot. Of course, in the meantime, our primary competitors decided that we were doing the right thing and they went and did it too, which the competition made for an even bigger market. Okay, change the slide. So by 2010s, the demographics, the fuel pricing, emission regulations changed the landscape. Turbocharging. One of the problems we ran into, and the Europeans had the same problem, is emissions. In the US, we control emissions by the average corporate fuel economy. In Europe, they control it by the amount of carbon monoxide that's put into the air. In any event, it became very obvious by the time we got to 2008 or 9 that the naturally powered, naturally aspirated engines weren't going to work with the fuel economy standards. We couldn't make them work. So we had to go to turbocharging, which is something the AG cars were also going to. And then that created its own problem because once you start turbocharging engines, if it's a 3-liter engine and you turbocharge it, it makes it a lot harder to get more out of it without turning the boost way up. And then you got to be careful of reliability. Now, once they did that, also the price delta between the AG production cars and the M cars started getting greater because we were going to a much more sophisticated car that required more development. The engines being the big part of it. So unfortunately, that makes the spread even bigger and it made it a little harder to sell the cars. The demographics are changing in the process, and that is that more and more of the buyers are younger. And we did a survey that found that the percentage of people, and this was 12 years ago, the percentage of people under the age of 40 that could drive a manual gearbox was a lot smaller than it was 10 years earlier. So to give you an idea, the Z3, which was the perfect example, when the Z3 was produced, about 50% of them roughly were made with manual transmissions. By the time we got to the end of the E92 M3 production, manual transmissions represented about 15 to 18% of the total production. They were becoming, and the AG cars, like the 328 and the 335 at that point, was down around 5%. It was becoming much more difficult to substantiate selling them. And unfortunately, when the volumes get that low, two things happen. One is the development cost gets higher because you have to completely homologate a manual gearbox car separately from an automatic gearbox car. It's two different animals. The second thing is that when the volume gets low enough, and it got really low, the dealers don't want to inventory the cars, because if you've got 10 cars on the lot and you want 10% of them to be a manual gearbox car, then you put one car on the lot and you make it black, and the next customer that walks in the door wants a blue one, so they want to order one, and they became cars that sat on the lot too long, and dealers don't like that. Leasing also becomes a big issue, and that hurts the whole business of modifying the cars, because it's hard to modify a lease car and not take all the stuff off before you give it back. And where they've supplanted the individualization a lot is all the stuff that BMW M and the parts department has come out with. You can put on the car combined with the limited production models that they've been building. I remember the first one we worked on was the matte gray paint job on the E92 M3, and we sold 30 of them, and we wanted to see how we were going to do with that. We sold 30 of them in about 30 minutes. Okay, next slide. So having been retired for 8 years, I'm not intimately involved in what's going on anymore. But I can tell you, looking at what's going on and having worked on cars up until about now, they're developing the next generation of cars I was never involved with. So the horsepower race, I'm thinking, is going to be over for two reasons. One is they're getting horsepower that's extremely high. Having cars that can do 0 to 60 in 2.5 and 3 seconds is great, but the volume for something like that at that price category is extremely small. Combined with the fact that we're getting more and more toward electric cars, and the younger generations, except for enthusiasts, are much more interested in electric cars than they are high horsepower cars. All-wheel drive is going to become more and more necessary when you've got 600 and 700 horsepower, because it's the only way to get the power to the ground without ending up spending a lot of time either spinning wheels or just spending time with the electronic systems trying to keep the engine held back until you can get the car going. I think down the road, and this could be 20, 30 years from now, but it's probably sooner rather than later, and that is you're going to have M cars with electrically powered or at least hybrid. There's really no reason down the road they couldn't produce the i8 again, same kind of car, and it couldn't be an M car down the road. I don't see that as being a problem. Individualization of the cars is going to create a greater price premium, which will not only allow them to make more money per car, but it also cuts down the volume because the number of cars sold just gets too small. And eventually, I was just talking about 2040. One of the benefits of all this, side benefits, and I've been kind of watching it, is the resale value on reasonable mileage M3s, both in the E46 and the E92, have been going up significantly to the point where they're almost up to the point of the price where they were when they started out, if there's one with not a lot of miles on it. So the resale value on the older cars, it's not good, because if you're trying to buy one as an enthusiast, it's kind of difficult. But on the other hand, if you're trying to sell one, it makes it a good investment, and that makes more people want to buy them. So that's kind of an understanding of the economics of the whole thing. I hope that helps you in understanding why some things happen and some things don't. You have to recognize that enthusiasts' overall car market represents somewhere between 4 and 5% of the market. And unfortunately, after another 15% that thinks it's fun to drive a car, you've got 80% of the market, or a number like that, that basically looks at a car as a necessary evil to get to work every day. And they're not very interested in it, which is very unfortunate, but that's the way the market is. Anyway, that's kind of it. I'm open for questions and discussion of any topics. I've got a list of questions here, but I'd be happy to see what somebody comes up with.
Okay, Larry, thanks for that. That was very, very informative. Much appreciated. That was, I think, a very interesting insight into the workings. I think Car and Driver and other car enthusiast magazines have tended to demean the role of bean counters, as they style them, when it comes, particularly with GM, but for all car companies, in terms of determining what we end up with as the finished product that we drive. But the reality is, all car companies are driven by the bottom line ultimately, and that's what it's all about. So while enthusiasm might be part of what beats in the part of the blood that goes through the heart of any beating enthusiast car company, they also have to be concerned to try to make money at the end of the day.
And you're absolutely correct. At the end of the day, if you're not making money, you don't last long. And a perfect example of that is when you take people like Lamborghini and Aston Martin and Maserati. They're all owned by much bigger companies because they couldn't make it on their own. Too small a product dynamic, too little volume. The other part of that, though, is we always liked, and even when I was at Ford, and that was a long time ago, they always liked the enthusiast part of the market, because they were the ones that would help them grow the market. They're the ones that talk about the brand. They're the ones that get their friends to buy something, even if it's not another M car. They're what we call in the marketing business the multiplier of the brand. So you definitely want to keep them happy, and you want to be able to produce products that they want that are fun, and that rubs off as a fun thing to drive for everybody else. So we always used to look at it as an important part of the market, but we still had to make money.
Yeah, so we enthusiasts are what they call today the influencers of the Instagram generation.
Yes, exactly. And I will tell you, I was the enthusiast that joined the company When I was working at Ford, it was really great when I could get a Mustang with a V8 in it. And I remember being told I had to order one with a V6 as my company car, and I quietly slipped the order in and then changed it to a V8, and my boss was furious when the car showed up. But it was the best thing I could do at the time, and I was going to get a car, so I was going to be darned if it wasn't going to be a good one.
Well, we've got a number of questions that have come in, and thanks for everybody who's sent those in. Let me try to pose those to you as we're here. First of all, not a question, but just from Matt M. He says, Larry, thank you for the 1M coupe.
Oh, well, let's get the story straight on that one, because I've had that one before. I didn't invent the car. What happened at that time was the economy was soft in 2008 and 9, which was because of the 2008 downturn, and the M3 had the price difference between that and the 330 at the time had gotten pretty large, and I was trying to figure out how to fill the gap. And the 1 Series was coming out; it wasn't even out yet. And I made a proposal to make an M car out of it, and was informed that that really couldn't happen for various reasons. And then what really kind of changed it in my mind was I brought in Albert Bierman, who was the head of development of M, who's now at Kia and Hyundai, heaven forbid, from Germany, and we brought him to Oktoberfest at Watkins Glen, and I want to say that was in 2009. And I'm fuzzy on that. It could have been 8, but I think it was 9. So, and we did a little focus group, and in the focus group, we asked everybody, what they would like to see. And of course, I knew a 1M coupe was going to come up. They didn't call it a 1M coupe; they called it an M1. And when I said, "Well, define what an M1 is," and we had like a session for about 30 minutes with everybody giving their input on what a 1 Series M car should be like. And we took that back, and Albert took that back, and they noodled it around for about 6 to 9 months, and then they came back with a proposal that ended up being the 1M coupe. He had told me they had played around with the idea, but I do think that the pushing of it by the owners, the car club members, really helped kind of get M to figure out how to make that work.
So here's an interesting one. This is from Ron Costel. He's asking, did the E28 M5 truly begin life as BMW CEO's security detail chase car?
I have to tell you, and being the person who ran the history on BMW for years and started up the Classic program, I had never heard that story until you showed me that question a couple of days ago. So I did a little research, and there is a video out that explains that was made in England. I have to tell you, it's a very reasonable concept. I'm kind of wondering if maybe we've got the cart before the horse here, and that they may have been noodling around with the concept, and then it was like, well, wouldn't these guys like to have this? Or somebody came along and said, wouldn't it be a good idea? So they built a bunch of them to see how it would work, and they decided they liked it and then went into production. But could that be the real story? I really don't know, but it's perfectly plausible.
It makes a great story either way.
Well, it certainly does.
So sticking with the older cars, I'll try and feed you the questions with some sort of chronology related to the to the cars themselves. So we have a question here from M Coupe themselves saying, how on earth did he get approved? Did the Z3 M Coupe get the green light for production? And apologies if M Coupe is a lady, but how did M Coupe get approved for production?
Well, I have to admit, I was not in the development of that car from a production standpoint. I was involved in focus groups for that car after it was developed, but before it was decided to be built. And some people came over from Europe, and we did about 8 or 9 different focus groups with people that bought cars that we thought would be competitive along with Z3 owners. And this was just the coupe. And we couldn't find who the buyer was going to be. We didn't have anybody that thought it was a neat idea. We told people that it would be a utilitarian version of the Z3. And I remember one guy saying, if I want a utilitarian car, I'll buy a Jeep. So we couldn't find the buyer. But the funny thing about it was that it kind of caught on anyway, but it caught on in the M version, because I think there were people that were BMW enthusiasts that bought it because it was the closest thing they were ever going to get to a Porsche. But it was a BMW. And I think that's what made the M version sell pretty well. The non-M version never really caught on the way they thought it was going to. The pricing structure on the car was kind of high compared to the Roadster. It was, I think, about $4,000 more money, and that was a lot. But again, the small numbers meant you had to cover the costs in some way.
The M Coupe versus the regular version of that car, the interesting paradox that the M version actually outsold the standard version.
Oh yeah, no, I'm well aware of that. In fact, I own the standard version. I own a 2002 with an S54 engine in it, or I should say an M54 engine. And in the final year, they made 230 of them for the U.S. market. So it's probably one of the rarest model cars they've ever made.
So we have Dave H here who's asking, what in your opinion, based on the data that you have that you presented earlier, what's the future of the manual transmission in M cars? And related to that, there was a similar question related to take rates on the manual transmission. That let me see if I can find it here quickly, but. Yeah, the take rate on the, you indicated the take rate at the end on the E90 series M3 was down around 15%, but on the F87 M2, it appears to be about 50-50. This is Kevin Tipton who's suggesting this. So
on the M2, I can see that. On the M3 and the M4, it's going to drop. The higher the price goes, the more likely you're going to get an automatic because you're more likely to get an older buyer. But let's talk about it not from the demographic standpoint. Let's talk about it briefly from the mechanical standpoint. When you put a DCT gearbox or an automatic gearbox in a car, you can control the gearbox automatically, or I should say electronically, along with the engine management system. So when you stick 600 horsepower in a car, or 550, whatever it is, and you want to be able to put power to the ground quickly, if you put a manual gearbox in it where somebody basically can rev the engine to 4,000 RPM, dump the clutch and go, you've got so much horsepower and torque in there that the driveline can't handle it. If you actually built a car that way, even the E90, it was the V10 M5. Remember, we had manual gearboxes in the V10 M5. When that car came over, it had launch control for the sequential gearbox. In the manual gearbox, they didn't bother to tell us until it got here, but it didn't have launch control, which wasn't very helpful. But we found that out from customers who wanted to know how to operate it. So I had to call Germany, and Germany said, well, it's not in the car. And then because that ensued another conversation. But the problem, they said, was in a sequential car, you can electronically control the amount of power going to the rear end through the transmission as you get going, because the amount of torque you put into it from rest to get going really dictates how much the differential and the drive shaft can handle. If you took that same engine and you put a manual gearbox in it and dropped it to 4,000 RPM, dumped the clutch and took off, you'd probably tear the rear end right out of the car. And that's what they told me. So they wouldn't put launch control in because they had no way to control it, which actually, after I thought about it, made sense. So you'll find a perfect example, the upcoming M3 and M4. You might have noticed, and I don't know whether this is an announcement or I haven't paid attention to it that closely, but I believe the M3 sedan is coming out with a manual gearbox, but the engine has slightly less horsepower than the DCT version of the car, which would have more horsepower, and they'll charge a little less for the car, and that gives them a different price point. But the reality of it is the manual gearbox is designed in such a way that it probably can't handle any more than they're putting through it, and that's why they had to reduce the horsepower and the torque. Manual, actually any transmission, is designed for two criteria. One of them is maximum RPM, and the other one is maximum torque. And if you try and put too much torque or too much RPM through the gearbox, you blow it up. And you don't want to do that when you're paying the warranty costs. So you have to cut down on what you're putting in. So that's kind of a heads up for people. If they buy a manual gearbox M3 in the next generation with a turbo motor on it and think that they can go and put some extra thing in the engine to get another 50 horsepower out of it, be careful. You may find you're going to end up going through gearboxes faster than you think, because the gearbox probably can't handle it. That's why they've done that.
There have been a couple of questions here from Keith and from Tim, who have they're really asking variations of the same things related to BMW has created what Keith called the mini M versions of a variety of cars, the M performance packages and things of this sort. Mm-hmm. Is that a reaction to the price premium? It's a way to fit a middle ground between that price premium that the M models now require in order to recoup their development costs?
To a certain extent, yes. You might remember in the 2000s, we came out in like 2008, 9, and 10, somewhere in there, we came out with what was referred to as a 335 IS. And mm-hmm. Then there was an M3, and then there was a 335i. And the IS had an M suspension in it, and they changed the brakes, and they put bigger wheels and tires on it and different wheels. And I think they dressed up the interior a little bit. And it was a package. But the whole reason they did that was because the M car the spread in price between the 335 and the M3 was too great, and they were trying to fill in the gap. The IS was not as successful as they would have liked because it just didn't mean enough. And when they did a lot of focus groups, they came back and said, well, what's this IS? We want an M car. So they went back and changed it so that you now have an M 335 or an M now 340, and then you have an M car. And the idea was to fill that in because the spread is too big.
I remember at the time when the 335 IS came out, and it was all the buff books picked up on this is an homage to the E36 325 IS and 328 IS, and hope trying to tap into that enthusiast vein.
And we had done the IS version, and that's why we brought it back, because we had done it in the E30 and the E36 and in the E46. So the E9293 version was a pretty no-brainer to come back with it and do it again, but it didn't catch on the way we thought it was going to. It was a good car too. I remember doing a press introduction for the car, and we were comparing it. I was driving around Thunderbolt in South Jersey with media guys, and I was impressed at how much of a difference the M3 was to the IS. The IS was a spectacular street car that handled really well. And the M3 felt like a race car that had been detuned for the road. And it's kind of, that's how I would describe it. But there was definitely a difference between the two. You knew it right away.
That's until the tuners got their hands on them and put on the big turbos and cranked down the screws on the wastegates and all that.
Well, yeah, I mean, all that other stuff. I'm talking about the production car. So.
Right. So there are a couple of questions here talking really about the technology and the weight that's getting loaded onto cars these days. Why is that happening? And do you see that changing as a direction in the future for M cars? Are they going to go back to more of the Colin Chapman philosophy of add lightness and simplify, or is weight an inevitable situation in the world we find ourselves?
Well, there's two things going on here. One is the fuel economy standards, and the force to electric cars and being able to get range with batteries is going to want you to get as much weight out of the car as you can. And a lot of effort has been put into that direction. On the other hand, you've got a whole pile of safety standards that require you to put a bunch of stuff in the car that we didn't used to have. So part of the problem is weight begets weight. So when you have a car that's got front airbags in it, you've got a certain amount of weight. When you've got a car that's required to have front airbags and side airbags in the front and rear door, and then the head protection program, I don't know exact weight, but you're adding weight to the car. So you're trying to get weight out somewhere else, but there's only so much you can get out of the car unless you go to exotic materials. One thing I think is interesting, and I'm just noting this myself as a personal opinion, but BMW back in the mid-2000s bought a manufacturer of carbon fiber out in the Northwest to make the carbon fiber roofs for the M3s and to build the carbon fiber for the i3 and the i8. In the last couple of years, I've read that they've sold that company off. So either they've figured out another way to make carbon fiber cheaper, or they've decided that in the long run, there isn't any way to make carbon fiber in mass production. And that's always been a big problem. It's a very labor-intensive process. You can't make carbon fiber very well on a production line, much like a fiberglass boat. You won't find any big fiberglass boat manufacturers like you will car manufacturers making hundreds of thousands or millions of vehicles, because The way you make fiberglass just doesn't lend itself to that process, and carbon fiber is somewhat similar. So I think they're looking for other materials. They've used a lot of aluminum. They've used composite plastics. Excuse me, much like the E92 M3 front fenders were plastic. And that saves a lot of weight. And they're working on that really hard, but when you've got to pass crash standards and put all the safety equipment in the vehicle and make it so it can roll over and the roof supports itself, there's only so much you can get out of the car.
And I think while we all might talk as enthusiasts about wanting lightness and simplicity and this sort of thing, we all like our Apple CarPlay, and we all like our cup holders, and we all like our air conditioning and everything else when it comes to driving cars on a daily basis too. If we're being completely honest with ourselves, we might like to have something else in the garage as well, but for the daily driver, and if you're M3, M4 money, for many people that is the only car, so it's a compromise.
I'll give you a perfect example on that. I did some research back when we were talking about in the 2008-2009 time period to get the price of the M3 coupe down. I actually went back to Germany and said, what if we made a version, because we had people that were buying them and making race cars out of them. What if we had a version that didn't have a lot of equipment in it, kind of going back to the M3 lightweight concept? And if you took the air conditioning and the stereo out, and you put cloth interior in it, you took the back seat out, and you took a bunch of stuff out, but unfortunately, you can't sell it as a race car. And at the same time, that means you've got to pass all the safety standards and emission standards. So you still got to put all the airbags and everything in the car. But let's see what we can get out of the car, the electric seats, all that stuff. And we could make a car that was a strip-out one that somebody could buy and make a race car out of. By the time they got finished with all that, because it was really, the development cost was the big part of it, it was just parts. They came back and said that if we took all that out of the car, it would save me $2,500. And then they told me I had to sell at least 3,000 of them a year. And I was thinking more like 300. So that didn't go anywhere. And the bottom line is we could build a car like that. It's simple enough to do. We could build one that doesn't have all the bells and whistles in it, but you're going to have so few people want to buy it. And the price is going to be so close to the regular one that nobody's going to want it. It's the problem you ran into with the lightweight back in the E95 period. I was
just going to mention that the E36 M3 lightweight as being kind of the poster child for that. Although they sell for silly money these days, particularly if they were owned by Paul Walker or sold by EAG. But the base car themselves, I remember 95 lightweight sitting in dealer showrooms in 96 and 97, and significant discounts off sticker prices for
well, when that car came out, there were two problems to it. The first one was it was more money than the car that was better equipped. Mm-hmm. That didn't make any sense. And then the second part of it was they postponed the production on it by about 6 months. So they built them at the end of the 95 model year, and they had the 3-liter engines, and they went to 3.2-liter engines, with the production starting right after they built them. So by the time we got them, everybody knew the new model was coming out with a bigger engine in it. So why would you spend more money for less equipment and a smaller engine?
Right.
You know, there was a running joke internally that proposing that kind of thing at BMW was a quick trip to going back in the field to selling cars to dealers. I mean, you just weren't, your career wasn't going to go anywhere.
And then all that stuff that made the car look different was stuffed in the trunk. And if you put it on the car, you invalidated the warranty.
Exactly. I mean, at the end of the day, the concept was good, but unfortunately, it just doesn't work.
Yeah. Unless you were lucky enough to buy one for relative pennies on the dollar at the time and sat on it for 25 years, in which case now you're feeling quite good about your decision.
Right. Well, by the same token, if you were to buy one now that was in perfect condition, you paid $95,000 for it, you're not going to go out and make a race car out of it.
Mm-mm. Mm-mm. No, there's some people who are kicking themselves for doing that back in the period, I'm sure. But
you know, you bring up something with resale value just as a thought, and that is, and you and I were talking earlier about this, the cars that were hardest to sell even in low volumes of BMW's history in the last 40 years are the ones that are worth the most now. And the ones we talk about were the M3, the M1, the E30 M3. The last year and a half we had to sell them. We couldn't sell them. They were giving them to company employees to drive for 5,000 miles and selling them as used cars. The E28 M5 had the same problem. The M Coupe Z3 was the same problem. We couldn't sell those. But look where they are now. If you got one in the lightweights, is a perfect example. If you got one now, it's got low miles on it, they're worth a fortune.
Yeah. So we had a couple of questions, so talking loosely about the same thing here, so we'll try and pick these up together. One question asking from Harold Kramer, asking if you think that another unique halo car in the M product line, the M1, is likely at some point. And then Mike was asking about the i8 and how it never seemed to be fully developed after the initial release, but you had alluded to the possibility of it being an M car in the future. So could that potentially be, in your opinion, some version of a new halo car, a new M1 would be the successor, let's say, to the i8, featuring advanced technology?
Well, let's remember, I haven't been there for 8 years, so I'm only giving you a personal opinion. Yes, I would love to see another halo car. I think it'd be fun. I don't think they produce exactly an i8, but if you did a car of that concept and made it an M car where it was a hybrid and they used the same types of concepts down the road, I could see something like that happening. But whether they're even thinking about it, I have no idea. One of the things that I think made the i8 somewhat of a non-development is that the development of hybrid and electric cars is advancing so quickly that you develop that car, you produce it, and you've got to cover your development costs. And to go back and try and really update that car with completely new technology would probably cost so much money that they'd never get it back. So they'd be better off if they said, fine, we built these, we made the Roadster version, that kind of added to the lifespan of the car. But to me, that would be the excuse for, all right, let's go back to the drawing board again and let's develop something to come out down the road at some point. And it adds all the new technology they've learned since, because the battery technology has been changing actually annually.
Yeah, it seems that Tesla's now investing heavily in a battery plant, their gigawatt factory, I think it is, for example. But
well, the battery has been the biggest obstacle to producing pure electric cars is the range. And they're getting much better at it. Tesla's done a good job. The i8 was great, but that had a little gasoline engine in it. But they're advancing that, but it's the battery technology that's really held electric cars back for a long time.
Interestingly, it seems that the new Z4, one of the reasons that BMW was able to even produce that car was because of the cooperation with Toyota, as far as being able to amortize a large chunk of the development costs against the Supra as well. You may or may not know anything about this, but do you know if there was any quid pro quo on the other side? Can we expect to see any Toyota technology trickling back into BMW cars in the future?
I remember they did that whole deal a long time ago, and I remember there was the original deal was that BMW had good diesel technology that Toyota wanted, and Toyota had some production and other things that BMW wanted, and that's typically the way those things work. I don't remember the details on that one at all, but the Z4 fits perfectly into what I just presented, and that was that the Roadster sales on a worldwide basis are only a fraction of what they were 20 years ago, and it's just the way the market's gone. So Roadsters have a tendency to kind of come and go. They were a big deal in the 60s and 70s, and they kind of came back in the latter 90s and through the 2000s, and then they faded again. They'll probably be back at some point, but it goes up and down. So if BMW wanted to develop another Z4 chassis, they probably looked at the numbers they could build and said, wow, we can't do this. This doesn't make any economic sense. But Toyota may have gone to them, or they may have gone to Toyota and said, hey, we've got an idea. So yeah, if you add the two together and you've only developed one basic chassis and everybody can change the springs and the shocks and modify them and put different body panels on it, yeah, you can definitely defer all your costs over a much larger volume. The other thing that I think, I'm guessing here, I don't know this for a fact, but I'm guessing that part of that deal was that Toyota could make a coupe and BMW made the Roadster. So my guess is you're never going to see BMW come out with another coupe, and there'll never be a Toyota version of that car as a Roadster, because if they did, they'd just be competing with themselves.
So all of the M coupe, the E36-8 and the and the Z4M coupe guys can are going to be crying in their beer to hear that there'll probably never be a direct replacement unless they have a Toyota badge on it.
Well, I don't like to use the word never and always,
Never,
but let's put it this way: I wouldn't be holding my breath waiting for one.
Okay.
And keep in mind, again, going back to the sales volume, neither one of those cars did exceedingly well on a sales volume basis. So the development cost, BMW probably didn't intend on building a coupe in the Z4 again, and in this model run, and so that building a lot more of them to cover the cost and letting Toyota sell coupes, which BMW thought they couldn't sell in numbers anyway, was fine by them.
Related to that, Larry, we've got time for maybe 2 more questions, so we'll ask this one and then maybe one other. There's a fun one here at the end just to finish up on. But Wills is asking, as far as take rates for packages and trim levels and things like that, and related to those amortization costs. He said, in his experience, it seems that marketing folks are consistently conservative with take rates on some of those things. What was your experience when you were there as far as that was concerned?
When you say conservative, I'm thinking in terms of we thought that the take rate would be lower than what the market actually went to.
I think that's my interpretation.
Okay,
too.
there's a little bit of let's go back to our economic model that I presented at the beginning, and that is take rates are the same thing as building cars. So as an example, if you've got, and I remember this back from developing the now outgoing M3, the one that was just outgoing, or the M4, I should say, the carbon fiber brakes. And they came to me back in the latter part of the 2000s and said, wouldn't it be great if we had carbon fiber brakes? And I said, yeah, but at the end of the day, at what cost? So they gave me a number and asked for a percentage take rate, and we gave them that percentage take rate, and they said, don't you think it'll be more? And there was a negotiated settlement on that. But if you make it conservative, then it allows you to control how long it takes to cover the development cost. And if you try and get too far out with the take rate and make it higher, and you don't reach it, then you get into an economic problem. And as a product manager, I'd be a lot better off saying the take rate's going to be 20%, and that's how we pay for it, and it turns out to be 35%, we make a ton of money on it, I look like a hero. But if I told them it was going to be 35% and it turned out to be 20%, I've got a problem.
Far better to under-promise and over-deliver.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, and you're still trying to get close, but you don't want to get so close that you're like, you made a mistake.
Right. So last question, and apologies to those of you who asked questions that we didn't have time to get to tonight. I was selecting the questions I asked, as you've probably seen and heard from Larry tonight. He has definitive knowledge of a certain time period, and some of the rest of it's speculation. So I've tried to focus more on the questions that have related to his specific experience. But this is an interesting one just to finish up on. So Brian Lancelot's asking, Larry, what are your thoughts on the SMG2 transmission that was in the E46 M3? I know what my thoughts were, so I'm interested in hearing yours as well.
Well, you know what? I was the product manager during that car. I did not develop it. I inherited it, when it came out. I had a lot of people complaining about it when I got the job. So I ordered one with it and said, okay, I'm going to live with this thing. And what I realized out of it was that if you went to a showroom and you went with a salesman and you got in the car and you went to drive it and you went for a 10-mile drive and came back, you'd probably hate it, because it was slow shifting and it felt kind of clunky. What I realized after driving around to it for a month is if we actually trained people how to drive it, it was a lot more fun and you got used to it. Not because you had to get used to it, it's because there were certain ways of driving it that made it actually shift quicker. If you understood the mechanical part of it, unlike a dual clutch transmission, an SMG gearbox is actually shifting from one gear to another, and it's a hydraulic system that makes it shift. So it's essentially doing what your right arm would have done with a gear shifter. That means you've got to disconnect it from one gear and connect it for the other gear. And the thing didn't want to disconnect from the gear it was in unless there was a little bit of a slack in it. Okay, so in other words, if you're driving a manual gearbox, the first thing you do when you want to shift gears is you don't pull it out of second gear to put it into third. You put your foot on the clutch, take it out of second, put it in third gear, and take your foot off the clutch. What you're doing in the process of that is you're taking the torque off the gearbox just long enough to release the gear that you're in so that it'll come out easily. If you were someone that drove around with an SMG and you kept your foot into it all the time, then what was happening was it had to electronically retard the engine slightly to get it out of one gear to put it in the next. I'm explaining something that took a nanosecond, but you get the message. What I found after a while is if you're driving it, even in traffic, but driving it fairly quickly, but not pushing it, when you go to shift, I found if I feathered the gas pedal very slightly as I shifted it, I could get it to shift a lot faster and more smoothly. And when I talk about feathering it, I'm not talking about lifting out of it. I'm talking about a very slight amount. And where I figured that all out was in those days, we had SMG gearboxes in the E46 M3s. And I was involved in the racing program at the time and got to drive a bunch of those cars and realized that I was doing the SMG. It wasn't even an SMG. It was what they call a no lift shift. In other words, you don't have to lift the gas pedal. Well, it was a lift shift, but you weren't doing the lifting. What was happening when you took it out of a gear and put it in the next gear, when you went to take it out of the gear, all they needed to do was short circuit one spark plug on one cylinder, and that was enough to lift enough of the torque off the transmission to get it out of the gear so it would more smoothly go into the next gear. And then I said to myself, well, shoot, if I did that with my foot on a regular SMG, would that work? And I found after practicing it for a couple of weeks driving around, I found very quickly that's what worked. So the problem we always had was the gearbox was not as good as the dual clutch gearbox. There's no doubt about that. But it could have been perceived as a lot better if we had figured out how to train people to drive it. But that's extremely difficult to do on a 5-mile test drive. I never solved that problem.
No, I had that exact experience. When that car came out, I went and test drove one for about 10 miles. And I thought, when the thought process was, this could be a car that I would enjoy and that my wife would also be able to drive because she only drives automatics. And I hated it. I absolutely hated it. But then subsequently, I got the chance to drive an E60 M5 with the SMG and to push the car much harder than I had the chance to push the E46 on the test drive. And pushing the car harder and using the SMG, it all started to make much more sense.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's unfortunate because by the time I really figured that out, we were beginning the 2006 model year, which was the last model year of the car. And at that point, the die was cast and we were done. But I actually enjoyed the car and it wouldn't scare me to have another one. I have not paid greatly attention to what happens to those gearboxes when they get high mileage on them, but I suspect they're like automatics. They eventually need to be reworked. But I never heard anything about them not being very reliable.
I think there are some external, I've heard there are some external components that can cause issues at pumps and things like this, but the good news is you can actually convert them, you can actually physically convert the gearbox to a manual.
Oh, okay.
It's what I've heard. I haven't done it or had personal experience, but that's the word on the internet, so it must be true, right?
That's one of the drawbacks to working for the factory is you're always dealing with new cars. So what happens to them when they're 8 or 9 years old? I used to care, they used to care, but the issue was we weren't attuned to doing what you just said, and that's converting one of those into a manual gearbox because it's not something anybody would consider doing when they're new.
Okay, well, that's all we have time for tonight. We've actually gone slightly over. Larry, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
Really appreciate it. I want to thank also everybody who's attended. We ended up with a total, I think, of 49 participants, including the Larry and the three of us who are panelists tonight. So I want to thank all of you for attending. Thank you for your membership in the M Chapter. If you're members, if you're not members, please consider joining us. We're planning more of these Zoom events or Zoom type events. It's RingCentral, but going forward in the future. Next month, we're planning an event with Jackie Jarrett, who many of you have probably read in the Rondell. She's a notable published historian, exceedingly knowledgeable about all elements of the history of BMW, and we've asked Jackie to present to us on the subject of the M1, the granddaddy of all M cars, and the convoluted story, all the ins and outs of how that car actually came to evolved from the concept through the intrigue with Lamborghini and the various production deals that the car went through before it finally arrived too late for the series it was intended for, but then how did BMW take it racing? So Jackie's going to tell us that story, and I think I know it's an interesting one because I remember reading about it at the time, and she's going to do a terrific job. She knows more about that sort of stuff than probably all of the rest of us put together, except for maybe Larry. So,
hey, do me a favor, when you have Jackie on there, ask her about the M5 and the security guys. She would know that.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, she's a good person.
Larry, thank you once again very much. I realize I promised everybody a fireside chat. I realize it's probably a little too warm still down in your corner of the US to have the fireside, but we've got the nice picture on the wall. You look comfortable on your couch, and thank you for a very pleasant evening.
You're welcome.
Take care. Have a good night, everyone.